This is Audible.
Belladonna by Adalyn Grace. Read by Kristin Atherton. Prologue. It started with the cry of a baby. Swaddled in a crimson gown, bold as blood, Signa Faro was the most striking 2-month-old at the party, and her mother intended to prove it. "Look at her," her mother crooned, lifting the fussy infant for all to admire. "Is she not the most perfect creature you've ever seen?" Rima Faro sparkled as she twirled her baby around the crowd. Every part of her was draped with elegant jewels, each of them a gift from her architect husband. Her silk gown was the deepest shade of cobalt, bustling over crinoline wider than anyone else dared to sport in her presence. The Faros were one of the richest families alive. All who attended this party sought to dip their toes into even a fraction of their wealth. And so they plastered their faces with the grins they knew Rima hungered for, and cooed at the child she held with such affection. "She's beautiful," said a woman, who watched Rima rather than the baby as she fanned her sticky skin in protest of the summer's heat. "Perfect," said another, purposely overlooking Signa's crooked little nose and wrinkled neck.
"She'll be like her mother, I'm sure, feasting on the hearts of unsuspecting suitors in no time."
This was spoken by a man who ignored how deeply Signa's eyes unsettled him. One, a winter blue, the other, melted gold. Both too mindful for a newborn. Signa never stopped crying. She was flushed with fuss, and her skin was clammy. All who saw her thought this typical. Summers in Fiore were a hot, wet blanket. Whether indoors or out, bodies glistened from sweat that coated skin like a veil. Because of this, no one expected what the baby already knew. Death had found his way into Foxglove Manor. Signa could sense him around her like one might sense a fly that brushes too close. Death was a buzz upon her skin, alerting the fine hairs on her neck. With his presence, Signa settled, lulled by the chill that blossomed with his nearness. But no one else experienced the same comfort, for death came only where he was called. And that night, he'd been called to Foxglove, where poison laced every drop of wine. First came the coughing. Fits of it overtook the party, but guests would cough into their pretty white gloves and pardon themselves, thinking the cause was something they ate. Rima was one of the first to show signs. Cold sweat prickled her temples, and she passed her baby to a nearby servant girl as her breaths thinned. "Excuse me," she said, a hand to her throat, fingers pressing into the sweat that pooled into the crevices of her collarbone. She coughed again, and when she drew her hands away from her lips, blood the color of her baby's dress stained her satin gloves. Death stood before her then, and the infant watched as he laid his hand upon Rima's shoulder. With a final inhale, her corpse fell to the floor. Death didn't stop with Rima. He swept through the grand estate, collecting the poor souls whose faces purpled as their chests seized with uncooperative breaths. He tore through dancers and musicians, stealing their breaths with a single icy touch. Some tried to make it to the door, thinking there must be something in the air, that if they could get into the gardens, they'd be spared. One by one, they fell like stars, only the lucky few who'd not yet tasted the wine able to make their escape. The servant girl barely managed to get Signa into the nursery before she, too, fell, lips bleeding rubies, as death slowed her heart and cast her body to the floor. Even as an infant, Signa was unfazed by the stench of death. Rather than stir from the panic around her, the baby focused instead on what no one else could see: the bluish glow of translucent spirits who filled the estate as death plucked them from their bodies. Some went peacefully, taking the hands of their partners as they awaited an escort into the afterlife. Others tried to claw their way back into their bodies, or to flee from a reaper who did not give chase. In the midst of it all, a dead and glowing Rima stood silently in Signa's room, watching with a deep frown and vacant eyes as death crossed the threshold. His footsteps made no sound as he approached the baby, his shape nothing more than ever-moving shadows. But death did not need to be seen. He was to be felt. He was a weight upon the chest, or a collar buttoned too tight. A fall into frigid, lethal waters. Death was suffocating, and he was ice. And yet, when he reached to collect Signa, who was full and settled with her mother's poisoned milk, the baby yawned and curled herself against the touch of death's shadows. He fell back, shadows retracting. Once more he tried to claim her, yet his touch did not show him flashes of the life this young child had led. It showed him instead something he'd never before seen. Glimpses of her future. A brilliant, impossible future. His touch could not kill the baby he circled around, as confused by her as he was fascinated by what he'd seen. Though Rima wished to stay, wished to wait for her child to join her, Death stepped back and offered his hand. To Rima's surprise, she drew close and took it.
"It's not her time," he said, "but it is yours. Come with me."
There were too many souls in need of ferrying to remain any longer. He'd be back, though. He would find this child again. Hand in hand with death, Rima's spirit cast one last look at the baby they left behind, alone in a house with nothing more than corpses for company. She prayed that someone would find Signa soon, and that they would protect her. Just as the night had begun with the cry of a baby, it ended with one. Only this time, no one was around to hear it. Chapter 1. It's said that 5 belladonna berries are all it takes to kill someone. Just 5 sweet berries, eaten straight from the foliage. Or, as Signa Faro preferred, mashed and steeped into a mug of tea. Her dark brows were slick with sweat as she leaned over the steaming copper mug, inhaling the fumes. Certainly, eating the berries straight would have been easier, but she was still learning the effect belladonna had on her body, and the last thing she wanted was Aunt Magda to find her passed out in the garden with a bright purple tongue. Not again, anyway. It had been weeks since Signa last saw the Reaper. Only a final breath would draw him out from hiding, and he never left empty-handed. At least, that was the way it was supposed to be. But Signa Faro was a girl who could not die. The first time Signa remembered seeing the Reaper, she was 5 and had fallen down the stairs of her grandmother's house. Her neck had snapped and was crooked as she'd watched him sideways from the cold floor. She understood, vaguely, that her young body was not meant to endure such things, and wondered if he'd arrived to take her. Yet he said nothing. watching as her bones snapped back into place, and disappearing when she recovered from a fall that should have killed her. It was another 5 years before she saw Death again. Signa had watched from her grandmother's bedside as Death took the woman's hand and eased her spirit from the body. She'd been ill for months, and she smiled and kissed Signa's forehead before letting Death guide her into a peaceful afterlife. Signa begged for Death to return, to bring her grandmother back, as Signa held the corpse's hand and cried until there was nothing left in her. No one else was able to see him, or the spirits he led, and she wondered if it was her fault this had happened, if she was to blame, because she was the girl who could see Death. She didn't remember how long she remained in that house before someone had smelled the body and come to find Signa, hair matted and clothes unwashed, curled at her grandmother's bedside. They'd whisked her away from the house, shepherding her off to the first of many new guardians to come. She spent the next several years testing her odd abilities. It had started with pricking her finger on a thorn and watching the blood bubble and then disappear, as though the skin had never been blemished. From there, the experimentation shifted into jumping off stones high enough to break bones upon falling. Signa came to realize she would feel only a sharp snap, then be fine for a cliffside stroll minutes later. But the belladonna berries were never meant to be an experiment. Just something she plucked from her aunt's unkempt garden after arriving several months prior, thinking they were wild blueberries. She'd had no idea they were poisonous until she fell upon the weeds, vision swimming. Death made an appearance then, watching from behind the bend of an oak tree. Even if Signa hadn't recovered too quickly to speak with him, she'd been too distracted by Aunt Magda, who found her in the garden clutching deadly nightshade, her mouth stained purple. The woman nearly had a heart attack when Signa bolted upright from the ground, the poison out of her system within minutes. Signa had learned something that day: how to draw Death out of the shadows. And with that knowledge, she refused to let him hide from her a moment longer. Signa lifted the tea to her lips, though her tongue only grazed the warm steam before the copper mug was knocked from her hands. She stumbled from the rickety wooden bench she was perched upon as the mug clattered to the floor and the violet tea spilled onto the worn, grey stone of the kitchen. Signa whirled to find Aunt Magda scowling. That was an expression she wore often, though if one was to look deeper, they'd see that her thin bottom lip and leathery hands trembled in Signa's presence. They'd see dilated pupils and a thin sheen of sweat upon her wrinkled forehead.
"You think I don't know what you're up to, demon child?"
Aunt Magda scooped the mug into her hands. She sniffed and peeked inside, scowling at the mush of berries.
"Filthy girl, doing the devil's work."
Aunt Magda threw the mug at Signa, who reeled back but couldn't avoid being struck on the shoulder. There was enough liquid left in the mug to burn her, and for the purple juice of the berries to stain her favourite grey coat.
"I warned you what would happen if you brought that witchcraft into my home."
Signa ignored her searing skin and looked her aunt hard in the eye. It was tea. Her voice was so firm that anyone who didn't know better might believe Signa was telling the truth. But unfortunately, Aunt Magda did know better. She thought herself too smart and too godly of a woman to be tricked by a witch. Not that Signa truly believed she was a witch, of course. Though she did have a love for botany and often found herself wishing that she knew a few spells. How wonderful it'd be to have a spell to tidy the dust from this hovel, or to feed herself something other than stale bread and whatever concoction she could think to cook up with the sparse ingredients Magda left for her.
"Pack your things,"
Aunt Magda snapped, as a draught of autumn air hissed through a slit in the kitchen window. She pulled the coat tight around her frail body. Her skin was greying, and every so often her chest rattled with a wet, hacking cough. There was a moment when Signa looked past her aunt and into the shadows, waiting to see if death was coming to claim Aunt Magda, as she'd feared ever since that cough started a week prior.
"You'll sleep in the shed tonight."
Magda's words were spoken so coolly that Signa's insides withered, and she found herself wishing she'd never had the misfortune of being taken in by the awful woman. It was a shame she had so few alternatives. Because of the inheritance she was to claim on her 20th birthday, and the allowance that her caretakers received from it, Signa had once been warred over by potential guardians. Her grandmother had won the First War, not out of greed, but of love. When she'd passed away, Signa was sent to live with her mother's brother, a young and healthy banker with a fine estate and fruitful love life. Though he often left her alone to care for herself, Signa didn't despise her years with him. She'd even had a friend to keep her company on romps in the woods and on espionage missions through the neighbourhood: Charlotte Killinger. Her uncle's love life proved to be too fruitful in the end, however. At the age of 30, he died from a disease he'd contracted from one of his many partners. Signa had hoped to be taken in by Charlotte's family after that, only to discover that her friend's mother had passed from the very same disease. That scandal was effectively the end of the girls' friendship, and Signa hadn't received so much as a letter from Charlotte since. Signa was 12 when the whispers began, made worse when her third guardian died in a tragic carriage accident on his way to pick her up, then when her fourth guardian drowned in her own bathtub after a sedative and too much liquor.
"The child is cursed by death," some said. "The wickedest of witches, spawned by the devil himself. Wherever she goes, the Reaper will follow."
Signa never said a word to dissuade them, because she wasn't certain they were wrong. She pretended she couldn't see the spirits she passed on the streets, or even shared homes with, hoping that if she didn't interact, perhaps they'd one day disappear altogether. Unfortunately, ignoring spirits wasn't so easy. Sometimes she thought they knew she was hiding from them, and were the worse for it, howling through the house or haunting mirrors, always trying to catch Signa surprised and frightened by their antics. Fortunately, there were no spirits living in Magda's house, though that didn't much improve Signa's situation. Aunt Magda was the sort who would lose herself in gambling halls for days at a time, always to return with empty pockets. She didn't worry herself with silly things like keeping the kitchen stocked, or ensuring that Signa could breathe properly in the dusty hovel she claimed was a home, and she cared only about the allowance that housing Signa provided. Signa understood her aunt's fear of her, expected it even, but it made for a miserable life. Only months from turning 20, she would soon be able to claim her inheritance and finally build a home of her own. One filled with light and warmth and, most importantly, people. She would parade through that house in a beautiful gown, catching the eyes of a dozen handsome suitors who would proclaim their love to her. And Signa would never again be alone. But to claim that future, she needed to confront death. That very night, preferably, before he claimed yet another guardian and damned her further.
"Pack, girl,"
Aunt Magda demanded again, her bony hands trembling.
"I'll not have you in my house tonight."
Pausing only to pick up her mug from the floor and examine the newest dent in the copper, Signa hurried out of the kitchen. The rickety wooden staircase groaned as she climbed, trying to think only of how the floor creaked as if offended by the weight of her steps, and the grime that covered the house from the floorboards to its craggy roof. She tried to think of the orb spider that lived upon a perfectly preserved web in a corner of the ceiling, out of reach, but always in view. Anything to get the dark thoughts out of her head. That there was something terribly wrong with her. That she was a monster. That everyone and everything would be better if only she were normal. Magda believed Signa carried the devil within her very soul. And perhaps that was true. Perhaps the devil was nestled comfortably within her, and that's why it was impossible for Signa to die. Regardless, that notion didn't change what Signa knew she had to do. Aunt Magda's cough rattled the house, and Signa moved faster. In her tiny bedroom in the attic, she slid her trunk toward the bedroom door to block anyone from an easy entry, and tiptoed back to the center of the room. Gathering up her skirts, she took a seat on the floor and removed her coat, taking the belladonna berries from a pocket. She set them before her, then retrieved a rusty kitchen knife from a second pocket and wrapped the tarnished handle in the folds of her skirt for easy access. Signa picked up 5 berries, and though she couldn't say why, she smoothed down her dark tresses and adjusted her collar to ensure she was presentable before letting their sweetness explode on her tongue. The poison began in her chest, as though someone had torn her open with a hot iron and seized hold of her lungs. Her skin was a leaking faucet, fat beads of sweat rolling from her pores. Signa heaved as bile burned her throat, shutting her eyes against the shadows that swarmed in and cast strange hallucinations. Only moments later, the effects of the belladonna were slipping away. It was a dose that should have killed a person, though one Signa could recover from in minutes. But she needed to stay in this moment for as long as possible, because this was what she was after. This was her chance to chase the Reaper and to stop him once and for all. Finally, ice spread its way into her veins. It was a familiar presence that seared her from within and demanded to be acknowledged. Signa opened her eyes, and death was there before her. Watching. Waiting. His presence was intoxicating and familiar, and it took Signa by surprise, as it always did. Writhing shadows cast into the vague shape of a human. So dark and void of light that it was painful to look at him. And yet, looking at him was all Signa could do, all she could ever do. She was drawn to him like a moth to a flame, and so, it seemed, was he to her. Death no longer waited at a distance, but bent over her like a vulture before its prey, shadows dancing around him. Signa looked up into the endless abyss of darkness, and though her eyes stung, she refused to look away.
I'd prefer you not summon me whenever the urge strikes.
The voice was not what she expected. It wasn't ice, nor gravel, but the sound of water in a meadow, slipping over her skin and inviting her in for a midnight swim.
I'm a busy man, you know.
Signa stilled, breathless. More than 19 years she'd waited to hear Death's voice. And those were his first words. She folded her fingers around the knife's hilt and scowled. If your intent is to ruin my life, it's time you tell me why. Death retracted, and as he did, warmth swept in, biting into her numbed fingers. She hadn't even realized she was cold.
You think that's what I'm doing, Signa?
The disbelief in his voice mirrored her own.
Ruining your life?
There was something concerning about those words, something overly familiar that sent chills shuddering across her skin.
"Don't say my name," Signa told him. "Upon death's tongue it sounds like a curse."
He laughed. The sound was low and melodic, and it had his shadows writhing.
Your name is no curse, little bird. I just like the taste of it.
It was strange, the things his laughter did to her. Though Signa had spent years building her words for this moment, she found that now she had none. And even if she did, what was the point? She couldn't let herself be swayed by curious words, not when his actions had all but ruined her life, stripping her of every friend, guardian, and home she'd ever had. And so she didn't let herself think any longer. It was time to seize her opportunity and see if death had a weakness. With trembling hands, she clutched her knife tight, fighting the heaviness in her limbs to gather all the strength she could muster. And then she struck him square in the chest. Chapter 2. The blade slipped through the shadows, and Signa cursed. Death peered down at his chest, and the shadows tilted as though he was cocking his head.
Now, aren't you a curious thing? Surely you didn't believe something so trivial would work on me.
Her lips soured at his amusement, and she withdrew the knife. She'd hoped the blade would do something, that it would deter him, or let him know that she was serious about him staying away from her. She wanted Death to see her as dangerous, as someone not to be toyed with. Instead, he was laughing. And because of that laughter, Signa barely registered the persistent banging at her bedroom door. She stilled only at the screeching of her trunk sliding against the wooden floor and Aunt Magda's yelling as she stormed into the room, sheet white and with the fear of the devil in her eyes. The woman wasted no time, trembling as she grabbed a fistful of Signa's hair and hoisted her from the floor. Her eyes darted toward the window, as though she intended to throw Signa out. Beside Aunt Magda, Death bristled, choking the air from the room. Ice bit into Signa's skin as she tried to pry herself away from her aunt's grasp. And though Signa knew she should tell him to stop, she didn't. Her aunt's eyes burned with hatred, and as the woman lunged for her neck, Signa gritted her teeth, took her aunt by the shoulders and threw her off balance. The moment Signa's skin touched Aunt Magda's, it was as though a fire burned through her veins. Her aunt fell back, as if stunned, breaths thin and reedy. The colour drained from her skin, as though Signa's touch had leached it all away. Aunt Magda tripped over a corner of the trunk, tumbling backward with a silent scream, lungs emptying themselves. She fell upon the floor with a smack, silent for perhaps the first time in her life. By the time Signa understood what had happened, it was too late to help Aunt Magda, whose glossy eyes stared hollowly at the ceiling. Death hovered above her, bent to inspect the body.
Well, that's one way to shut her up.
His tone was light with mirth, as though this were all a joke. Signa's breaths then came not in sips, but in panicked gasps. "What have you done?" Only then did Death straighten, recognizing her panic.
What have I done? I'm afraid you're mistaken, little bird.
He spoke with the same slow inflection one might use when instructing a child.
Take a breath and listen to me. We haven't much time.
Signa heard none of it. When she looked at her hands, they were the palest blue, as translucent as a spirit's. She tucked them behind her with a low moan. "Stay away from me," she pleaded. "Please just stay away." There was an edge in Death's voice when he replied, a hint of darkness looming in the meadow.
As if I don't already try.
He turned from her, and Signa could only watch as Death reached through her aunt's corpse and tore the spirit from her body. That spirit took one look at Signa, then at Death, and her eyes widened with understanding.
"You rotten witch!"
It felt as though the ground were falling out from beneath Signa's feet. Already her mind was crawling in on itself, her vision tunnelling as she stared down at her trembling hands. Hands that had betrayed her. Hands that had stolen a life.
"What have I done?"
she whispered, her body curling into itself.
"What have I done? What have I done? What have I done?"
And then, with dawning horror,
"What do I do?"
First, you take that breath.
For some reason it eased her nerves to hear Death speaking and not Magda, who sat staring at her translucent body in shock.
I assure you, I did not expect this.
"What do I care for your assurances? You're the reason this happened!" Signa didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so the sound that escaped her was a mix of both. Death's shadows tripled in size as darkness enveloped the room.
You summoned me. I've done nothing but come where I was called. I'm not your enemy.
At least at this she knew to laugh. "Not my enemy. You are a perpetual cloud upon my existence. You're the reason I've spent my life in places like this, with people like her, surrounded by spirits. You're the reason I'm miserable. And look at what you've done now." Her eyes fell to the corpse in front of her, and Signa buried her face in her translucent hands as tears burned hot. "You've damned me. Now no one will ever want to marry me."
Marrying?
Death stared at her incredulously.
That's what you're crying about?
She sobbed harder, the words doing nothing to ease her spiraling mind. Had Signa been looking, she would have seen that Death's shadows wilted. She would have seen that he reached out for her, only to draw back before she could reject him. She would have seen his shadows wrap themselves around Magda's mouth, silencing the woman before she could say another cruel word.
I never meant for this to happen.
His voice rang genuine.
Our time is limited, and I know that whatever I say right now you won't hear it, but I'm not your enemy. In 2 days' time, I'll prove it to you. Promise me you'll wait here until then.
Signa made no such promise, though it wasn't as if she had anywhere else to go. Still, she didn't look up until Death was gone, and warmth crept back into the room, bringing feeling back into her fingers and toes as life once again coloured her skin. The effects of the belladonna had worn away, leaving a pulsing headache and the seething spirit of her aunt as the only reminders that Death had visited. Signa took one look at her through watery eyes, and Aunt Magda scowled.
"I always knew you had the devil inside of you."
Without argument, Signa fell back upon the floor to stew in her misery. Signa stood before the crooked door of her dead Aunt Magda's house later that evening, hugging herself as she waited for the coroner to finish his work. He made haste, not because he was unnerved by the body, but because he was fearful of Signa, with her raven hair and oddly coloured eyes, and of the crowd of neighbours who watched from a distance with knowing looks. You never asked for this to happen,
Signa whispered to herself as she braced against anxious onlookers.
You may have thought it, but thinking is not the same as doing. You are good. People could learn to like you. This is his fault. His fault, his fault, his fault.
It was her new mantra. Signa hated death even more now than she did before. Hated what he'd somehow caused her to become. Though she couldn't say she was sad that Aunt Magda was gone. Or at least, mostly gone.
Are you going to let them take me?
Aunt Magda's spirit croaked, angry even in death.
You owe me, girl. Are you going to let them stuff me into a bag like that? Do something, you little witch. I know you can see me.
Unfortunately, I can hear you too,
Signa grumbled, realizing she'd spoken aloud when she earned a surprised blink from the man lifting her aunt's bagged body into the back of a black carriage. Unsure what to do, Signa stared between him and her aunt's floating spirit until the man grew uncomfortable and excused himself, sputtering on about how sorry he was for her loss and how he'd be in touch. All the while, neighbours held their crosses tight around their necks, whispering that they always knew there was something off about the girl, telling anyone who would listen that Signa was a bad seed, and that Magda should have known better than to invite the devil into her home. There was even a spirit among them in a loose white tunic, who crossed themselves over and over again as they stared at Signa with empty, hollow eyes. She tried not to scowl. It didn't matter that their gossip bothered her. It didn't matter that she would have given anything to have just one person to confide in, because they weren't wrong to fear her. Signa had used the powers of the Reaper. She just needed to figure out how it had happened. Signa's skin prickled as she backed away toward Magda's house, hoping neither the neighbours nor her distracted aunt, who was busy making a fuss about her body as the coroner's carriage disappeared down the street, would follow as she sneaked away and into the garden. The term garden, in this case, was used loosely. Over the years, the land had decorated itself with weeds and wildflowers Magda had often complained about, and that Signa spent hours tending to as well as she could without so much as a shovel or shears. If there was anything she'd miss about Magda's home, it was the garden. She made her way beneath a willow, knocking the overgrown foliage to one side so she could lean against the tree's trunk. But she wasn't alone. Beneath the leaves, covered with dirt and clover, was a hatchling. It was so new to the world that its eyes were shut tight, its skin pink and fleshy, without a single feather. Signa stooped to inspect the poor creature, which was covered in soil and hungry ants that had every intention of devouring it alive. The insects overtook it, ruthless in their pursuit. Signa couldn't help but sympathize with the creature. It was like her, cast out of its nest and expected to fend for itself. Only it was not as capable as Signa, for it could not cheat death. It would be a mercy for the creature to die swiftly and be put out of its misery. But Magda's death had been an accident. If Signa took another life, on purpose this time, what did that make her? She didn't want to give any consideration to the thought, yet she knew that she needed an answer before she was face to face with anyone else she risked hurting. Tentatively, she peeled her gloves off and brushed the tip of one finger along the hatchling's spine, sweeping away some of the ants and debris that had collected. She held her breath, waiting to see if its death would come. Curiously, the hatchling continued to writhe on the ground, its heart pulsing. Again, she pressed a bare finger upon the bird, longer this time. When she pulled her hand away, the creature was still breathing. She leaned back against the trunk of the willow, with tears of relief prickling her eyes. Her touch hadn't killed the poor bird. Her touch wasn't lethal. Unless there was more to it. She remembered the belladonna in her pocket, and with a shaking hand, Signa drew 5 berries from it. Ensuring that the foliage would conceal her from anyone who might wander by, she popped the berries into her mouth and let them burst upon her tongue. The symptoms came fast, the nausea, the swimming vision, and there, across from her, Death himself stood once more. Though she knew he'd come, she refused to acknowledge him, glad that he waited at a distance. She reached out once more to stroke her finger along the bird's spine, and this time its heartbeat ceased, and it stilled with a final, relieved breath. Signa drew her hand back and clutched it to her chest. There was no denying it. With just a touch, she could bring death. But that death would come, it seemed, only when the Reaper was in her presence. Only when Signa was in this strange space, teetering between life and death. She had so many questions, yet not once did Signa spare death a glance, as she forced herself from the ground, leaving the dead hatchling upon the soil for the ants to claim as she stumbled toward the house. She was glad, at least, that the hatchling would no longer feel pain. Glad that, if she was to be a monster, at least she could deliver mercy. Chapter 3. A polished ivory carriage arrived 2 days later. The barking of a neighbour's hounds signalled its arrival, and Signa's chest tightened as she glanced out the kitchen window to see the commotion. She'd practically been living in the garden since her aunt's death, saying her goodbyes to the plants and waiting for the days to pass while she ignored the spirit who rampaged through the house. Aunt Magda was atrocious even in death, rustling the curtains and howling her frustrations whenever she wasn't telling Signa how much of a pest she was, or snooping on the neighbours. Signa had received a letter the day prior, one with a red wax seal, and signed by a Mr. Elijah Hawthorne, extending her an invitation to his home, Thorn Grove. It was with surprise that Signa recognised the name as the husband of Magda's granddaughter, Lillian. She'd heard Magda complain about the young woman before, telling stories of the wealthy socialite who'd cut off Magda's allowance with no warning. Signa had spent all day and well into sunrise the next morning, staring at the letter, unconvinced it wasn't a figment of her imagination. She didn't want to consider how death must have managed it, and though she had half a mind not to take this offering, Signa was no fool. Setting off for Thorngrove was the best option she had. There was little choice but to put aside her tea, clutch Elijah's letter tight, and hurry outside. The carriage didn't buckle as it clattered over the thick vines and damp moss that erupted between the splitting cobblestones. The 2 horses that pulled it had dark black coats slick with sweat, their nostrils dripping from the exertion, but their bodies were healthy and coiled with muscle. Signa couldn't help but think of her own bony wrists and scrawny legs, and be a little jealous of these horses whose diet was surely superior to her own. The massive stallions huffed as they halted before her, and an elderly coachman shimmied down. He was a rail-thin man, tall and fair-skinned.
"Morning, miss."
Tipping his top hat, he propped the carriage door open.
"I presume you're the lass I've been sent to pick up?"
"I believe I am." Signa trembled like a hummingbird. Someone had truly arrived to retrieve her, to whisk her away to a family high within the social hierarchy, with whom she might wear beautiful gowns and sip tea with other women, and have the life she yearned for. It seemed too good to be true. She kept glancing toward the shadows, waiting for death to appear, laughing as he told her it was all a ruse.
"My orders are to bring you back without delay," said the coachman. "We've got a bit of a journey ahead of us. Have you got any belongings?"
"Just a trunk, sir. It's right inside. I can get it." The driver waved away her words with a smile so bold it was alarming. Signa couldn't remember the last time she'd seen such an honest smile.
"Nonsense, miss. It's my pleasure."
Unused to such politeness, she could only nod as he toddled toward the house and wonder whether she was meant to stand there or get into the coach. Signa didn't have to wait long for her answer. A cough from the coach signalled that the driver hadn't come alone. A boy, younger than anyone she'd expected, in his early 20s at most, emerged from the carriage. The young man was dressed handsomely, fitted in a frock of the deepest black and matching leather boots. He was tall as a willow and broad as an oak, with a full head of soot-black hair that curled behind his ears. His skin was tanned from the sun, and there was a whisper of freckles dusted beneath eyes that reminded Signa of smoke, a pale and wispy grey, with a halo of dark coal around each iris. He had a small scar cut diagonally through the arch of his left brow.
Just look at the gold lining on that carriage. Of course my granddaughter Lillian felt the need to show off her wealth. It's not as though the wretched girl ever thought to help me out. She's a silly, awful thing, just like you.
Magda's words dripped with bitterness as she circled the boy. But for once, Signa didn't care. There were 2 rules Signa knew about spirits. The first was that Magda could haunt only the land where she had died, and the second was that should her corpse be burned, her spirit would be torn unwillingly from the earth. It was the first rule that relieved Signa, for it meant that she would never have to see her dreaded aunt again.
"It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. I hope your journey was comfortable."
Signa cleared her throat and gathered every bit of politeness she could. She even attempted a curtsy in her heavy bombazine gown and black feathered veil, which was itchy and the only attire she seemed to wear lately. The young man didn't return her formality. He cut a severe look around the withered porch and the unkempt garden, too full and crowded to walk through without stepping on overgrown weeds.
"I'm Silas Thorley, and I'm here on behalf of Mr. Elijah Hawthorne to escort Miss Farrow back to his estate, Thorn Grove."
His voice was the low rumble of an approaching storm.
"I assume you're she?"
Having expected a Hawthorne, Signa noted his name with interest.
"I am."
"Wonderful,"
he drawled, taking more interest in smoothing out the dark leather gloves that fit his hands like a second skin than he did in her.
"Into the carriage we go. It's as Albert said. We've quite the journey ahead of us."
"If you need to rest, I could make tea."
Silas adjusted his cravat and paid her little mind.
"I'd prefer we not linger at this hovel for a second longer than necessary."
She clenched her teeth, but pressed on.
"What about the horses? Do they need watering?"
Silas tipped his head toward the sky and squinted. When he inhaled a long breath, Signa got the sense that he was searching the clouds for his lost patience and was coming up short.
"You're kind, but the horses have informed me that they too would prefer not to linger at the risk of catching a disease. Come now, Miss Farrow."
Silas motioned toward the carriage, offering a gloved hand to help Signa into it. The carriage was small, and Signa had to keep her tense body pressed against one side so she didn't accidentally bump Silas's knees, which were spread widely and far too comfortably in such tight quarters. A moment later, when her travel chest had been loaded and Albert had climbed back onto the coach, the snap of the reins sounded and the horses took off. Silas's smoky eyes found Signa's briefly before he picked up a newspaper and spread it across his lap.
Uncertain of what she was meant to do, she looked for another copy, or anything else she might read, but found nothing. "You're not a Hawthorne, then?" Signa asked, feeling it necessary to say something when before company. From what she'd gathered in a book her mother had left behind for her, A Lady's Guide to Beauty and Etiquette, it was scandalous for an unmarried woman to be left alone with any man. Yet given the grand carriage and all she'd heard, there was no doubt the Hawthorns were wealthy and of high society, and thus quite respectable. Perhaps then Signa's book was out of fashion. "Could Mr. Hawthorne not come for me himself? Or Lillian?" Silas blew out a quiet breath and stretched his long legs the best he could. He was far too tall for such a space, having to sit hunched like a crow perched upon a log.
Lillian is dead, and Mr. Hawthorne's daughter Blythe is sick. So no, they couldn't.
Signa stiffened. Death, it seemed, had beaten her to Thorngrove.
I'm sorry no one was there to see you off,
Silas muttered, seemingly as uncomfortable with making small talk as Signa. "It's no bother. I'm quite used to handling myself." Besides, the only one who could have been there for her was Aunt Magda, whom Signa would prefer to never see again. Every spirit that walked the earth was tethered to the world by some sort of intense emotion, like anger or sorrow. She'd seen weeping women staring out windows, and spirits arguing back and forth, stuck in an enraged loop. Signa had gotten used to their patterns, and was skilled at avoiding them, for spirits frequented the same spots until they eventually decided to pass on from this world. In all her years, Signa had known only 2 spirits to pass on. Most, like the raging Aunt Magda, who was beating on the door of the carriage and shouting,
"Don't you dare leave, you witch! Don't you dare just leave me here!"
could spend years roaming the earth, feeding off their most pressing emotions. But leave they did, down streets of cobblestone where the scent of cinnamon and apple lay thick in the autumn breeze. Signa sighed her contentedness the moment they were too far from Magda to follow, listening to the occasional swish of Silas turning the pages of his newspaper.
You seem relieved to be leaving,
Silas noted after a moment, eyes on his paper. She grunted without thinking, for how true the words were. "Anywhere is better than this place," she said, as she tipped her head against a window, settling in. She didn't notice that Silas's fingers had stilled on the pages, did not see the dark look that crossed his face as his jaw tightened, and he buried himself in his reading. If she had, perhaps she would have thought twice about Thorngrove, and all that awaited her. Chapter 4. Signa hadn't expected they'd need a train to reach Thorngrove. When she'd first smelled smoke in the air, she'd shut the coach's windows, thinking they'd pass it by. But as the coach slowed, Silas pressed a thin yellow ticket into her hand. She'd never been on a train, though she'd read in the papers of how fast they were. The new way of travel, a modern luxury. It took Silas clearing his throat for her to catch her bearings and slip out of the carriage. The moment the heels of her boots hit the ground, Signa was swept into another world. The station was a massive building of slate grey, adorned with the face of a clock that was so large it could only be described as imposing. It struck the hour, the sound like a gong reverberating through the station. Inside, the weathered floors were yellowed. Flies swarmed over stuffed trash bins, and the distinctive scent of musk from too many rushing bodies hung in the air. A spirit was present, too. A man in a long black coat with worn holes in the bottom sat upon a bench and watched the passers-by solemnly. Signa averted her eyes, giving him a wide berth.
Dirty as the station was, there was something grand about it. There were men in business attire who held the most luxurious walking sticks, and women in bonnets and cotton day dresses bustled about, all of them with somewhere to be. A few took to benches set up at each platform, skimming a newspaper or puffing on cigars. Others hurried through the station, clutching their belongings as their eyes skimmed up to the giant clock that lorded over them. An older gentleman with a proud chest escorted a grinning woman who couldn't stop staring down at the ring on her finger. Pulled in by a habit from too many days spent alone, Signa filled out their story in her head, imagining that they were newly married and off to start their honeymoon. She envisioned all the beautiful gowns that were packed away in the woman's travel chest, made from the lightest fabrics, so that she would feel the salty air upon her skin as she and her beloved travelled seaside. Desire curled within Signa, so fervent that she forced herself to turn away from the couple. What might it be like to be a woman like that? To be swept away across the country by a handsome man she couldn't stop grinning at, silly with happiness. Beside her, Silas murmured something under his breath. Signa nodded and pretended to listen, lost in her daydream and a sea of more people than she'd ever seen. She barely managed to weave around them all as she and Silas made their way through the station, led by a helpful young attendant who'd taken one look at her ticket and offered to carry her chest. It was solid and heavy, yet Silas didn't offer the boy his help. In fact, he kept stone-faced and silent, as if making a point of not looking at the attendant.
"You'll have the compartment to yourself, miss." The attendant's voice was breathy from his struggle with the weight of the luggage. "The finest one on the train." Signa had never wandered through a place so busy, and where everything around her felt grand and vast. Where it felt like she'd be lost forever should she make one wrong turn. Though Silas perpetually looked like someone who'd swallowed a sour tart, she was glad to have him there with her in the event that she got lost. "Have you travelled often?" she asked. The response came from the attendant beside her. "Not often, miss. I'd love to, if I could manage it between work, but they keep me busy." Signa turned to glance at the spot where she'd last seen Silas, only to discover his absence. Sucking in a breath, she scanned the crowd until she saw him. There, straight ahead, stepping onto the train. A moment of panic struck, and she spun to the attendant, scooping her hands beneath the travel chest he carried. "Here, give me that," she said. "I'll take it the rest of the way." The attendant flinched, but tightened his grip. "It's really no bother, miss. This is far too heavy for a lady." Fearing there was little time to argue, she pried the chest from his arms. It was, indeed, extraordinarily heavy, made from pure mahogany and fastened with iron locks. It certainly wasn't intended to be carried by a woman in heels and morning wear, but she'd manage. The tightening of her lungs, the worry of being separated from the sole person who knew where she was headed and could help her if she got lost, was far worse than the extra weight. "Thank you so much for your time. I can manage from here," was all Signa said to the attendant before hurrying after Silas, attempting to take long steps despite her swaying back and shaking arms. Several people offered to help, but already the conductor was calling out for final boarding, and Signa could focus only on getting herself and her belongings where they needed to be and not getting separated from the devil that was Silas Thorley. By the time she made it to the train, her skin shone with sweat, and her breaths were so heavy that no one looked her in the eye. Even burdened by the weight of her belongings, Signa had to take a moment to admire the beauty of the train. It was finer than she'd expected, with black iron handrails and sturdy wooden tables that had red leather benches on either side. Her ticket indicated a private room where Silas waited, lounging upon a plush velvet seat with his boots kicked up onto the matching maroon seat across from him. He took one glance at Signa and wrinkled his nose.
My God, I had no idea a woman could sweat so profusely.
If Signa truly were a witch, she might have boiled Silas alive. "I wouldn't be sweating if you hadn't decided to run ahead without me, sir." At this, Silas scoffed. A foul, repulsive sound.
I should have known you weren't listening to me. Had you not allowed yourself to fall prey to distraction, you'd have heard me say that I was going ahead to ensure that our compartment was in order.
Signa bit her tongue. Now that he had reminded her, yes, she did recall that Silas might have said something, and that yes, she had nodded. Still, he should have been louder. Choosing not to respond, Signa set about storing her luggage in the overhead bin. Heavy as the chest was, her arms trembled as she tried to lift it above her head. She was grateful for an excuse to keep her back to Silas, but she couldn't quite manage the maneuver. Her muscles seared, and after several solid minutes of pushing through and ignoring the aching, they eventually gave out on her entirely. Signa stumbled back, momentarily convinced she would soon be paying death another visit after being crushed by the travel chest. But before she could fall, Silas was on his feet, bracing her from behind. From head to toe, Signa flushed as his chest pressed against her back. She'd never been so close to a man. Silas didn't appear to share her surprise. While she was still focused on the firmness of his chest, he stepped to the side and took the luggage from her, placing it in the overhead bin.
Why would you choose to carry something so heavy? He asked. Had I not been here, that chest might have fallen upon your face. What would you have done then?
I suppose I would have been faceless, she answered, indignant. And again, I wouldn't have needed to carry it if I hadn't had to race to keep up with you. I feared you'd left me. Silas threw himself into his seat with a snort, legs insufferably outstretched.
You should have told me you walked so slowly. I might have thought to carry you had I known.
She took her seat across from him, wondering if his unbearable personality was some sort of test for her patience. Holding her knees together so that they wouldn't bump his, she flashed a razor-thin smile at her escort and asked, "Would you mind sitting a bit straighter, Mr. Thorley?" Silas peered down at himself.
Am I sitting oddly?
Good God, she would need strength to deal with this man. With the toe of her grey boot, Signa tapped one of his knees, then the other. They were too far apart. "You're sitting like you're the only one in this compartment." His blink was slow, and though Signa knew he understood, he didn't right himself or apologize. Silas only laughed and shut his eyes as if he intended to take a nap.
You're certainly forward.
She tried her hardest to have good manners, but there was something exasperating about this man. Something about his aloofness and constant staring, as though he'd already decided Signa was a nuisance, caused those manners to waver and harsh words to slip out. Signa could barely stop herself as she took hold of her dress and hiked it up to her knees, freeing enough room for them to spread apart like Silas's. "It would seem my manners are as impeccable as yours. I expected someone in your position to be more polite."
And what position might that be, Miss Farrow?
"The position of escorting a lady."
A lady?
He cracked open his eyes, assessing her unseemly posture and the hiked-up dress, before shutting them again.
Let me know when we find one, and I'll happily escort her.
"Ignore him," she told herself, forcing her lips into a smile that could burn. "You are to be a lady, poised and graceful and demure." She folded her hands together and patted her dress back into place. Feigning calmness, Signa inspected their compartment. Beside Silas was a trolley stuffed full of sugary treats and baked goods. There was sweet sea salt toffee, boxed sticky buns that dripped with thick syrup and golden walnuts,
tiny pastries that oozed plum jelly, and so much more. She was so busy feeding her eyes that she nearly jumped when Silas whispered,
"Could I interest you in a handkerchief, Miss Farrow? I believe there's some drool on your lip."
She did everything in her power not to cast him a loathing stare, then inquired, "Are these for us?" He looked to the trolley, but no light shone in his eyes. There was no delight upon his lips, nor a hunger roaring from his stomach.
"They must have come with the compartment,"
was all he said. Flat, factual, as though there wasn't a feast of sweets before them. Signa found herself wondering if perhaps this man was inhuman. A lady's guide to beauty and etiquette claimed that there were important rules when it came to dining in front of others. There were certain forks to be used, and a particular order of eating things. Yet Signa longed for the treat so fiercely that her stomach protested her resistance, loudly. She froze, waiting in horror to ensure that Silas hadn't heard. Luck, however, was too infrequently on her side. Silas arched one fine brow as he leaned forward and took hold of Signa's hand. Though both her hands were gloved, Signa stiffened when Silas slid a handkerchief into her palm. His voice was coy when he spoke.
"You look as though you're in pain."
She wrapped her fingers tight around the handkerchief, thinking through a million things she'd like to say, not one of them proper or polite. Instead, she said, "I had a large breakfast. It would be rude for me to indulge." Silas's smile was a scythe. A surprising thing, curt and cleaving. There one moment, and gone the next.
"It would be offensive to waste so much food, Miss Farrow, especially when it was bought for you. Show some respect to Mr. Hawthorne, and eat."
Perhaps Silas wasn't the absolute worst after all. Signa didn't need to be told twice to pull the trolley toward her. She reached immediately for a tart with bright yellow custard and glazed strawberries, the top sprinkled with powdered sugar. Because there was no cutlery or plates, she slipped off her gloves and tucked them at her side, eating with her fingers. "Will you be rude to Mr. Hawthorne, then?" she challenged Silas between bites, doing everything in her power not to groan from the tart's deliciousness. It had been ages since Signa had eaten something so overwhelmingly sweet. She polished it off within a minute, moving right on to a sticky bun. Silas blinked at the sweets, as though the idea to eat one had never occurred to him. He peered at the cart, scanning over each item before selecting a tiny tea cake drizzled with orange marmalade. As he ate, his posture became less severe, and his furrowed forehead less grim. The moment he finished his tea cake, he glanced back at the cart for another. "Tell me more about your work with the Hawthorns," Signa said, while he chose a small fruit tart. It seemed like a simple enough subject, nothing too personal or too taxing. Even so, Silas hesitated before answering.
"I used to work closely with his wife, but I'd be surprised if Elijah even knows I exist."
"He sent you to escort me?" Signa pressed, as she tried not to lick her fingers. "Surely he knows who you are." Silas took perhaps the largest bite Signa had ever seen anyone take, then said,
"I was sent by one of the staff. Mr. Hawthorne's daughter is dying of the same illness that took his wife. He's not in the right state of mind to know anyone's name right now."
She was glad for the excuse of toffee in her mouth, as she pondered what her future would be like at Thorn Grove. Perhaps this journey was little more than a cruel trick. Perhaps she'd arrive only to find death had already staked his claim upon everyone there. Perhaps this was his next move, in an elaborate game of chess. and she was stuck playing a pawn. Or maybe he really was trying to prove himself to her.
It's my turn to ask a question,
Silas said.
Do you know what you're getting into by coming to Thorngrove?
She knew so little about the place, and though his question was unnerving, it didn't change her answer. It doesn't matter. I've nowhere else to go. Silas faced the window next to him, where distant paved streets gave way to a glistening ocean. It made her wonder, would there be an ocean close to Thorngrove? Or perhaps there'd be a forest, or nothing but sprawling, rolling hills.
Your arrival is what Lillian would have wanted,
Silas said eventually.
She wasn't someone who could refuse an orphan.
Orphan. Signa hated the word. Hated how it was something that, to most people, defined her and her situation so thoroughly. What about the estate itself? She asked, hurrying to change the subject. Has it been there long?
Thorngrove is a beautiful place, and I'm told it's been passed down for many generations.
Signa tried not to grimace as she polished off a tart. Places that old were likely crawling with the very spirits she was trying to avoid. And Mr. Hawthorne is a businessman? She asked, rather than let her thoughts linger. Does he work in banking? She was surprised when the corners of Silas's lips quirked.
Not banking, no. The Hawthorns own the most popular gentlemen's club in the country. Its members are dukes and earls, princes even, so I've heard. The wealthiest and most affluent people only. It keeps him a busy man.
At this, Signa scrunched up her nose. The idea of a club for only wealthy gentlemen seemed ridiculous. Do they have a club for women as well? Lines of confusion etched into Silas's forehead.
For women? Of course not.
What about one for all people, then? Even more lines.
There's not one of those either.
That's a shame. Signa rested her head against the window. Were they more inclusive, the Hawthorns could be twice as wealthy. Her words came easier, for it was comfortable in this compartment, even with Silas. He was rude, certainly, but not cruel. And over the past hour, his brooding had undergone significant improvement. Is that your business too, Mr. Thorley? The club. His eyes shifted to the trolley cart, skimming over the remaining items.
No. I used to work in the garden, but it was closed after Mrs. Hawthorne's death. Since then, I've been tending to the horses.
Signa looked to Silas's boots, too fine a leather and not nearly so worn as she would expect of someone who spent his time in a stable. The leather of his gloves appeared new too, as did his coat, with its polished silver buttons and tiny ruby cufflinks. It didn't seem as though he'd have any reason to lie, and yet Signa found it difficult to believe that Mr. Hawthorne would send a stable boy to retrieve her. For now, she made no comment, deciding it was better not to sour the mood. Why would they close the garden? Signa plucked another toffee from the trolley and leaned back against the velvet seat cushion. Though excitement burned in her blood, the sugar was making her tired, and her eyes would drift shut any time she looked out at the ocean.
Because that's where Mrs. Hawthorne would often spend her days. She's buried there beneath the flowers.
There was something calming about the evenness of his voice. No surprising inflections, no emotion seeping through. Just a steady lull that she found herself relaxing into. Was her death a pleasant one? The question hung oddly upon her lips, and she wished at once that she could take it back. Pleasant was a word few would associate with death. But Silas
fortunately, understood what she was asking.
I presume you've seen a flower wilt, Miss Farrow. That's what watching Lillian was like. She was like a beautiful flower, cherished by everyone who knew her. Even the illness loved her so greatly that it gave her little reprieve. It wanted her to itself, and so it stole her life suddenly.
And what was that illness? His brows lowered.
It was such a mystery that the doctors could never give it a name. One day Lillian was fine, healthy, and the next she was vomiting blood. A few days later she lost her ability to speak. Her mouth had festered with the disease, and eventually she lost her tongue to it.
Signa turned to the window again, though she could see Silas fidgeting from the corners of her eyes.
I'm sorry if I've offended you.
His words sounded genuine.
Such conversations are not suitable. My apologies.
He couldn't see that Signa's hands were fisted tight, buried in the folds of her dress. I take no offence, sir, she said. It's just that I sometimes find myself wondering why death is so needlessly cruel. Something twisted in the lines of his forehead.
I think, for someone in as much pain as she was in, death might have felt like a reprieve.
Signa tried to find some truth in the words, but all she could see was the blood on Aunt Magda's lips and the hollowness of her eyes as she fell. All she could think of was how her aunt's hatred had kept her from journeying to the afterlife and had tethered her to earth for who knew how long. Perhaps, she said, voice barely a whisper. But I don't believe that makes death any less cruel.
And why do you say that?
She folded her hands upon her lap, trying not to let the bitterness creep into her voice. Because death is only a reprieve for the dead, Mr. Thorley. It cares little for those it leaves behind. Chapter 5. There was something strange about the maple leaves. Those that lay scattered across the lawn of Thorngrove were deeper in colour than any Signa had seen before, some of them rich as coffee, others the burnished red of dried blood. The pitted roads their second carriage had travelled upon since arriving by train morphed into manicured cobblestone, so white and pristine it looked as though someone had dropped to their knees and scrubbed each stone. Tall, manicured hedges lined the endless stretch of road that led to the estate, some of them twisted into elegant spirals or trimmed into the shapes of horses or swans. The exterior of Thorngrove was grand, a massive brownstone manor like the kind she imagined her parents had once owned, situated upon rolling hills that were fading to yellow to welcome the shift into autumn. There were windows at least 3 times her size, pointed red rooftops protected by sculpted winged beasts, and finely lacquered carriages pulled by muscular horses that trotted through an iron gate strung with jasmine and ivy. Dozens of people meandered across the lawn, gentlemen and ladies in their finest suits and most eye-catching bustles filtered in and out of the manor with flutes of champagne balanced gingerly between fingers and laughter upon their tongues. It was certainly a far cry from Aunt Magda's. There was wealth everywhere Signa looked. Dignified pillars surrounded the courtyard, inlaid with whorls of gold. On the second floor of the manor, delicate stained-glass windows of a million colours shone over a balcony. Even the soil itself looked rich, and the grass somehow wilder and more vibrant than what lay beyond the gates. There were no weeds to be seen, and tiny orange and yellow wildflowers bloomed across the hills, stretching toward a thick grove of trees in the distance, the start of the woods. No place had ever stolen her breath so thoroughly.
Signa found herself pressed against the carriage window, fogging the glass as the landscape unfolded before her. She felt like a minnow in a springtime pond, small and insignificant among such beauty. As the carriage rolled to a stop, it took everything in her power to remember her manners and not throw the door open so that she might hurry and explore, but instead wait for the coachman to clamber down and open the door for her. When he did, the brisk autumn air grasped Signa around the shoulders, carrying the scent of sap and earth and twirling leaves underfoot. It wisped through her dark tresses, and she breathed in its greeting as she made her way up the path toward the magnificent estate. Waiting upon the massive porch, 3 people watched Signa at a distance. A portly older man, a gentle-looking woman, and a young man with the most severe expression she'd ever seen. The younger man stood upon the threshold of Thorngrove in a fine navy suit that fit him like a glove, his shoulders squared as he observed the guests filtering in. He was far too young to be Signa's guardian, yet the pride in his frame spoke of his comfort at the manor. It'd do her no good to simply stand there, yet Signa waited a beat longer, wishing at once that she had a mirror. Even a large body of water or a polished stone would do. Anything she could see her reflection in, so that she might ensure she looked presentable. She fussed with her morning dress, smoothing out the bombazine to make it more presentable.
That couldn't be Mr. Hawthorne, could it? Oh, he looks so young. Tell me quickly, am I presentable?
She looked to Silas, whose smoky grey eyes skimmed over her just once. At the worry in her voice, he softened a little.
"That isn't Elijah," he said. "And you look fine, Miss Varro. Given how far we've travelled, I'm certain they wouldn't mind if you arrived haggard."
She wondered whether that was meant to reassure her.
If you could introduce me, Mr. Thorley, it'd be much appreciated.
But Silas drew back with a dip of his head.
"Believe me when I say it would be better if I didn't. Mr. Hawthorne didn't give the staff much notice of your arrival, and not everyone will take kindly to someone of my status being sent to escort a lady such as yourself. You'll have to handle introductions on your own, I'm afraid."
There wasn't time to press for further details, as Silas was already escaping down the hill behind her and towards the stables. Left standing alone among fallen maple leaves with panic in her chest, Signa swallowed and tried to quell her fretting by recalling the introductory lessons in her mother's etiquette book.
1. A woman should always wear a smile. 2. A woman should never shake the hand offered to her, but accept it with cordial pressure. 3. For a woman, meekness and modesty are considered 2 of the most respected virtues. They are to be practiced at all times.
Signa had trouble believing the 3rd rule was one anyone should adhere to, though for the sake of her future, she'd try. Skirts in hand, Signa started up the path to the manor. Curious eyes and pointed whispers followed her, and step by step, Signa found herself wishing only for a deep enough hole in which she might hide. It was impolite to be seen dressed in morning wear at a soirée, yet what choice did she have? It seemed a poor day for her new guardian to hold such an event, though she was in no position to comment. When she approached the young man at the door, Signa could see from his smooth face and intense eyes that he was even younger than she'd assumed, in his early 20s. Up close, he reminded Signa of a fox, with bright green eyes that were friendly, but a little too squint as they peered down at her. The sun had leached away colour from his hair. It wasn't red, nor was it blonde, but somewhere odd and in between. A rich harvest orange, brassy and bright. There was a hitch in his jaw as he looked her over, clearly attempting to level his disapproval.
"Miss Farrow?"
asked the older man beside him. He was stout and of an olive complexion, dressed in a fine black suit. Though a smile lingered beneath his full black moustache, his eyes were dark and tired things.
"Welcome, I'm Charles Warwick, the butler of Thorngrove.
"It's a wonder you've arrived," said the younger one, his chin dipping as he inspected her. "Father told us of you just this morning. Welcome, cousin. I'm Percy Hawthorne."
Signa extended a hand, and when her cousin accepted it after a beat of hesitation, she squeezed with her best effort at cordial pressure. Percy's lips pressed into a thin line as he drew his hand back, tucking it behind him. Perhaps that was too much pressure then. Or maybe not cordial enough. Or was this a situation that warranted a curtsy and no handshake at all? A lady's guide to beauty and etiquette really ought to have been more specific. "We're glad to have you staying with us, Miss Farrow." Signa was relieved to turn her attention to a curvy woman who had soft, strawberry blonde curls and was wearing a dress the colour of blue forget-me-nots. "Do you not have an escort?" The woman glanced behind Signa, as if expecting someone else to appear. When no one did, she took Signa by the shoulder. "Never mind that. I'm Marjorie Hargreaves, governess to the master's daughter, and now to you as well. Your room is already in order." Her voice was soft as a song. "Should you need anything, I'd be happy to—" She jumped as glass shattered somewhere near the estate's entrance, followed by laughter that sounded inebriated, to put it kindly. Percy's eyes flashed, though that lasted for only a moment before he rectified himself.
"Warwick will see to it that your belongings are moved in promptly. You should have no trouble settling in."
Marjorie motioned for her to follow them into Thorngrove, and once inside, Signa knew that her cousin was right. The estate was grander than anything she could have imagined. They could have put her in a stall with the horses, and she would have been just fine. Anything was better than living at Aunt Magda's, but Thorngrove was on a level of its own. Still, there certainly were a lot of people. "Is Mr. Hawthorne celebrating something?" she asked, hoping for an indication that this was a rare occurrence. Percy scowled, and though he opened his mouth to respond, Warwick cut in with a swift,
"It's nothing to pay any mind to right now. If you're wanting to attend, then worry not. There will be plenty of soirees for you to join in the future when you're properly dressed and prepared."
Signa brushed a clammy hand over her gown. "Come," Marjorie said with a kind smile. "You must be tired after your travels." She jumped at the sound of another crash, followed by even rowdier laughter in the ballroom ahead, but she never once looked away from Signa. Percy's focus, however, was divided.
"I look forward to getting to know you better, cousin. Welcome to Thorngrove."
Hat in his hands, he bowed to her before turning on his heel and heading off toward the sound of the breaking glass, Warwick following behind. And though Signa's curious mind lingered, Marjorie allowed no time for her thoughts to fester. "Come," Marjorie said again. "I'll show you to your suite." Marjorie escorted Signa up one of the two grand mahogany staircases that led to the second level of the massive 3-story estate. The governess made polite small talk, but kept peering down, craning her neck to sneak glances at the party below. So distracted was Marjorie that she hadn't noticed the man who leaned upon a banister that had been sculpted to look like the branches of a gnarled tree and twisted up the entirety of the 2 staircases. Signa noticed him, though. Noticed he had hair black as pitch, a long, pointed nose, and sinister eyes that cared only for Marjorie. When the stranger leaned forward to snatch hold of her hand, Marjorie practically leapt from her own skin.
"How are you such a difficult woman to find, Miss Hargreaves?"
His voice was low and unpleasant, as if he was speaking around something lodged deep in his throat. The man wore shoes of the finest leather Signa had ever seen, and his rich black suit appeared to have been custom-made, with buttons of melted silver. In his hand was a walking stick he grasped tightly, a stunning piece of rosewood with a brass handle that was carved into the shape of a bird's skull.
"I've been looking for you everywhere."
"Lay a hand on me again,"
and I will push you over this banister, Byron. Marjorie ripped her hand away, placing it instead upon Signa's back with some force. Come, Signa. Pay these guests little mind. They're forbidden on the upper levels.
I'm no guest, Miss Hargreaves, the man tried again, but Marjorie didn't spare him so much as a second as they hurried up the stairs, much to Signa's disappointment. She rather disliked puzzles, for she had a bad tendency to need to solve them. Life, she believed, would be much simpler if one had the answers all laid bare before them. It had only been an hour since she'd arrived, and already Thorngrove was filled with curiosities. It was odd that Mr. Hawthorne would hold a soiree the same day as her arrival, let alone that he'd sent a stable boy as her escort, and kept her coming a secret until the last moment. And what were they celebrating downstairs at such an early hour, with the echo of laughter and shattering glassware? Signa wanted to ask, but the tension pulsating in Marjorie's neck warned her this wasn't the time. Signa was a beggar, not a chooser, and she needed to play what few cards she had carefully. Her skin itched, and she wondered if this was all some sort of trap, some clever ruse of Death's. Had he known Elijah would invite her to stay? Had Death been the one to pull the strings? And if so, how? It took what felt like ages of walking through long stretches of dimly lit halls before they arrived to Signa's new room, a space nearly the size of Aunt Magda's entire house, with a sitting room, bedroom, and her own bath all attached in one suite. In the sitting room, the wallpaper was beautifully latticed in varying shades of green, with velvet gold curtains draped across glass doors that opened onto a balcony. Rich mahogany floors were covered with an oversized Persian rug decorated in emerald and gold, and Signa wanted nothing more than to curl her toes into it. The ceiling itself was a brilliant white, with thick moulding embellished with expertly carved vines and flora. It matched the fireplace, where yellow peonies blossomed from thin glass vases upon the mantel. Plush reading chairs were meticulously placed around it, while a dainty wooden drawing table sat behind, close to the window. Light shone upon it like a halo from the gap in the curtains, warm and inviting. Signa's heart squeezed as she took it all in. This was the most beautiful space she'd ever seen, and somehow it was hers.
Will I be able to meet Mr. Hawthorne this evening? She asked. I'd like to thank him for allowing me to stay here.
The master is a busy man, Marjorie said, as she helped a distracted Signa out of her coat. The woman moved to put it in the armoire, but upon seeing the stain of belladonna berries upon a more thorough inspection, she scrunched up her nose and draped the coat over her arm for laundering. But I will speak to him of his plans for you, and I assure you that you'll be well taken care of. You'll be fitted for new dresses in the morning after your lessons.
Keep listening to this audiobook. I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.